Last week I did an overview that was not almost, it was ancient history. Now I'm going to race through some periods. Those of you that have been with me in Jerusalem and gone to the light show in the Tower of David will remember some of this history because it's illustrated so beautifully in the light show. But we left last week with the destruction of the Second Temple. And the Romans actually were the only ones who completely made Jerusalem free of Jews. It was called Aeola Capitolina, and it was a city where the Jews had been expelled. And those of you who have been in Rome have seen the Arch of Titus, and you saw the menorah from the temple being triumphantly carried into Rome. The Jews were essentially expelled from Jerusalem. And the Bar Kokhba revolt was a tremendous failure. That was 132 to 135. And the Romans pretty much ruled the area until 313. In 313, Rome accepted Christianity, and the Byzantines took over the area, and that lasted about 300 years. So the Byzantine Empire was there for 300 years. And then the Muslims conquered the area. They built the Dome of the Rock, and the Muslims were there as sole controllers for a very long time also. Nearly, well, I would say 450 years. They took over in 636, and the Crusaders conquered them in 1099. The Crusaders ruled for nearly 300 years, from 1099 to 1291. And again, if you have been with me in Akko, you see the Crusader city, you see the Knights Hospitaliers, and you see the struggle, which was a struggle that succeeded in controlling Jerusalem for a while. But even after they lost control of Jerusalem, they hung on until they were expelled completely, and the Mamelukes took over. And the Mamelukes held the country from 1291 to 1516. And this was, again, Muslim rule. And then in 1517, the Ottomans took over. And the Ottomans had the longest extended period of domination of Jerusalem and of the Middle East. And it lasted for them for 400 years, from 1517 to 1917. They were defeated in World War I, and the British took over. The Jews under the Ottomans began to reestablish themselves. Jerusalem was a walled city. It had 4 quarters. It still has 4 quarters. It's still a walled city. And the 4 quarters were the Jewish quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Christian quarter. The oldest quarter was the Jewish quarter, which was situated near the Kotel, near the wall that we call the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. The Armenian quarter is the second oldest quarter, and it's the Armenian quarter because the Armenians were the first to establish a Christian presence in Jerusalem. Then we have the Christian quarter, and then the last quarter was really the Muslim quarter. In 1860, Montefiore said, we've got to bust out of these walls. And he built Yamin Moshe. And if you walk down, you'll see the windmill, you'll see the horse-drawn carriage that he came in. And why is there a windmill? Because he built something so that flour could be milled and the Jews could live outside of the city walls. That was, in essence, the beginning of modern Zionism. And it's important for you to remember that in many ways, the Zionist enterprise was first financed by Montefiore and then financed by Rothschild. And Baron Maurice de Hirsch, who was the third philanthropist who Herzl appealed to, and I'll talk about that later, but did not succeed, did not engage in trying to resettle the land of Israel, but actually resettled the country of Argentina and eastern Connecticut and southern New Jersey with Jews from Russia who he was putting on farms. There was, in our discussion of ancient history, the cataclysmic events of the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, and they were events that were very local to us, to our worship of some deity that was based in Jerusalem, and that deity did not protect Jerusalem, but somehow we held on to that deity. The cataclysmic event in the 19th century was the cataclysmic event that would be a combination, well, the late 18th century and the 19th century, of the Enlightenment and scientific inquiry. Those two forces played havoc, not just with Jewish tradition, but with all sorts of traditions. When Darwin was contemplating publishing his book, his greatest fear was that he was refuting the Bible. Now, our refutation of the Bible goes back to Spinoza, and really even earlier, when thinkers tried to reconcile Greek thought with Jewish thought. But the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment of the late 18th century were major challenges to traditional Jewish way of life. A major challenge to traditional Jewish way of life. The second challenge was the creation of nation states. And I alluded to this last week. The creation of Italy, the creation of Germany, the consolidation of countries where the people were indigenous, the language was the lingua franca, it's what they spoke, and somehow the Jews were not part of that process until we were given emancipation in France. And the emancipation in France didn't work out as well as everyone had hoped, as shown by the Dreyfus trial. But the return to Zion, the idea that there was a, quote, Jewish problem and it had to be solved, was becoming a critical issue. In the mid-19th century, two rabbis, Yehuda Shlomo Alkalai and Zvi Kalischer showed up and said that Zionism was the necessary preparatory stage for the coming of the Messiah. So that was Jewish traditional religious approach to Zionism. At the same time, a socialist approach to it with a much more secular bent was advocated by Moses Hess, who argued that the Jews were not a religious group, but rather a separate nation who needed to go back to the land of that nation and develop a language of that nation, and that our universal religious values would be recognized in the creation of a separate secular Jewish state. I said last week, and I'll repeat it again, that there was this religious Zionism. There was also another response to the Enlightenment and scientific inquiry, and that was the Reform Jewish movement. And the Reform Jewish movement essentially made exactly the opposite argument. Said we are not a nation. We don't have our own land and our own language. We are a religion, and these are the values of our religion, and we're going to express those values through Reform Judaism. That tension actually continued very strongly until the Six-Day War. And next week, when I talk about the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, I'm going to talk about how religious training in America, particularly for rabbis, was completely revamped after the Six-Day War. But things began to get very practical in the 1870s. The 1870s saw a movement called Chovevei Zion, Lovers of Zion. And that movement had three goals. Auto-emancipation. Remember, emancipation was the Jews were given emancipation by France, by Germany, by Italy. So the argument was, we have to emancipate ourselves. Auto-emancipation. The second goal of Chovevei Zion, Lovers of Zion, was we have to change our productivity and our professions. Historically, the Jews, because of all sorts of Christian rules, were involved in banking and finance, in jewelry, in professions, medicine, that had nothing to do with the land. And Chovevei Zion said, we have to get back to agriculture. And they said, we have to get home rule. Home rule is an interesting concept, but those were their three goals. And the people who committed themselves to those goals were called the Biluim. Bilu from Beit Yaakov, Lechuv Elcha, the house of Jacob. Let's get up and get going. Lechuv Elcha, sort of like Lech Lecha that God said to Abraham. This was Lechuv Elcha, and their activities were supported by Baron Edmund de Rothschild. The two towns that you have to remember for Baron Edmund de Rothschild is the first town is the second home of Jerry Schwell in Israel. Jerry, unmute yourself and tell everybody what town that is. Wait, I'll unmute you. Talk.
Rishon LeZion, which means first to Zion, 1882.
And what was Baron Rothschild's connection to Rishon LeZion, Jerry?
Established the winery, Carmel Winery, which is still there but crumbling, unfortunately.
Right. And who knows what the second city was?
Petach Tikva?
No. Another wine city.
Zichron Yaakov.
Zichron Yaakov. Zichron Yaakov is where they still make Carmel wine today. And it's quite a beautiful winery. So Baron Edmund de Rothschild facilitated the return to the land, and he did it in a way that he knew, which was cultivating grapes and providing wine. The type of wine that they provided at that moment was not fine Bordeaux's or Chardonnays. It was essentially kosher sweet wine for Shabbat. And that they grew and published. Third goal, the home rule goal, was a goal that Herzl took hold of and galvanized by convening the first Zionist Congress in 1897. Now remember, the first Zionist Congress was the result of Herzl, an assimilated Viennese Jewish reporter, covering the Dreyfus trial and seeing with his own eyes how anti-Semitism was corrupting justice. Now, Dreyfus was eventually exonerated, and the trial ended many, many years after he was convicted in his favor. But nevertheless, that was the spark that got Herzl involved in the Zionist movement that existed before. The Baron Maurice de Hirsch also thought the Jews should return to the land. And the whole Romantic movement of return to the land was not just a Zionist movement. It was almost an anti-industrial movement. It was an effort to take away the harshness of industrial factories and restore what by then was a romanticized way of life, of living off the land and taking care of yourselves off the land. The ideology of Herzl was penned by him in many different ways. Pamphlets and books, The New Ghetto, The Jewish State, Alta Neuland, and Herzl really believed that the Jewish question could be solved politically. And ironically enough, he conceded that solving the Jewish problem politically would not only solve the problem for the Jews, but would solve the problem for the anti-Semites. Because the Jews would be out of Europe. There would be no more Jews in Europe. So there would be no longer a Jewish problem. Herzl was a bundle of energy, and he went around Europe negotiating. As I said, he negotiated with Baron de Hirsch. You know, he had Rothschild on his side, but he negotiated with Baron de Hirsch. Baron de Hirsch said, it's not going to work. The land is not big enough for all the Jews you want to put in it. I'm going to keep working on moving Jews to Argentina. But he also did political work beyond the Zionist Congress. He negotiated with Kaiser Wilhelm. He negotiated with the Sultan of Turkey. He negotiated with the King of Italy. He negotiated with Pope Pius X. And he negotiated with the Russian Minister of the Interior. So here you see a man who single-handedly was going around the world arguing for a political solution to the Jewish problem. Now, there were pogroms in the late 1800s, but a particularly horrific pogrom happened in Kishinev in 1903. And this pogrom frightened Herzl to death. And the British offered Uganda as a place for Jews to go and settle and to escape the persecutions in Europe and particularly in Russia. Herzl accepted the idea. So this great Zionist thinker, after the Kishinev pogroms, said, we've got to rescue the Jews. I'm big into practical Zionism. Uganda will be a temporary haven. But boy, did he get in trouble. At the Sixth Zionist Congress, Chaim Weizmann and many other Zionists lined up against him and defeated the resolution to accept Uganda as an offer from the British. And a year later, the British withdrew their offer. Herzl died a year later in 1904. I think just exhausted from his combination of running all over the European arena to negotiate and then committing to the idea of Uganda and being so resoundingly defeated at the Sixth Zionist Congress. His defeat, though, galvanized the people who believed we have to settle the land. And the land has to mean more than just a secular political homeland for the Jewish people. And into this post-Herzlian world enters Echad Ha'am, who became Chaim Weizmann's confidant. I remember, Chaim Weizmann is the man who defeated Herzl's push to go to Uganda. And Echad Ha'am came and said, you know, it can't just be politics. It has to be culture. It has to be Hebrew. It has to be something that gives the Jews of the world a national culture that's focused in Israel, but not every Jew is going to move to Israel. The struggle now was a struggle for the nature of the state of Israel. There was political Zionism, there was religious Zionism, there was spiritual and cultural Zionism. There was also a recognition that we needed something more than a messianic approach to solving the Jewish problem. And that messianic approach did get a political party, which was called the Mizrahi Party. And those of you who think Mizrahi means Eastern, Jerry, I don't know if you think that, but
I do. I do.
But you're wrong, and it's something that many people are wrong about. Mizrahi comes from Merkaz Ruchani, that Israel was going to be the spiritual center of the Jewish world.
Easy Yofi.
Right. It's a totally different thing. And the struggle between Messianic religious Judaism and political socialist Zionism was a struggle that goes on to this day. After World War I, when the Turks were expelled, the Ottoman Empire was defeated, the British were given the mandate of Palestine. 1918, they're ruling the country. 1922, the League of Nations formally gives Britain the mandate over Palestine. The mandate over Palestine was important. Why? Because Balfour had already said, under the influence of Chaim Weizmann, that the Jews are entitled to a national homeland in Palestine. So here we have a colonial power running the mandate in the Middle East, the Palestinian mandate. And we here had Britain first offering us Uganda and now offering us a partitioned part of the British mandate. The Arabs were fighting against it already. They were fighting against it all along, but they began to really fight against it. So in 1920, two significant organizations were created in Palestine. One was the Histadrut, the labor union. It's a national labor union that encompasses all of the trades and all of the laborers, and the Haganah, the self-defense force. Haganah means defense, that eventually became the Israel Defense Force, the IDF, Tzva Haganah Yisrael, Tzahal. So 1920, we get the Histadrut and the Haganah. 1922, the League of Nations gives the mandate formally to Britain, who controlled it because they conquered it at the end of the war. 1924, listen to this is important, the Technion was established. That's a year before Hebrew University was established. So the Technion was established in 1924, and in 1925, the Hebrew University was established. Some of you have been on trips with me to Israel when we've gone to Mount Scopus. And there's a story that actually, not a story, an observation that Roger Brooks shared with students when we took a trip to Israel with college students, and it was an observation about height. The temple in Jerusalem, the first and second temple, sit on Mount Zion, Har Zion, which is the top of a big hill. When they built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they built it even higher. So it's above where the temple was. When they built the Hebrew University, they built it on Mount Scopus, which is even higher. So this new temple of learning, which is what the Hebrew University was and is, held the high ground in Jerusalem. And it's on Har Hatzafim on Mount Scopus. Judah Magnus was the first president of the Hebrew University. Judah Magnus, Nachum Goldman, Martin Buber, there were many Jews who believed that the modern state of Israel should be a bi-national state, that the Arabs should live in Israel and the Jews should live in Israel, and they should live in Israel together. The vast majority of the Jews thought that that was a very naive idea. But Judah Magnus was the president of the Hebrew University for a long time, but when he retired, he left Israel because his vision of Israel was not the Israel that was being realized. The same thing for Nachum Goldman, who founded Beit HaTfutzot, the Museum of the Diaspora. Both of these men and many others felt that the, quote, negation of the diaspora was not the right way to go. But for many Zionists, to this day, the negation of the diaspora is still a fundamental, foundational aspect of their belief in the state of Israel. When the kosher market was attacked in Paris, Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Paris, and he gave a speech that to my ears was horrible, even though it was very Zionist, and I'm very Zionist. And the speech was almost what Herzl said at the Dreyfus Affair. He said to the Jews in Paris, "You have no future here. You have to come to Israel." And by the way, many, many French Jews now are making Aliyah. And there are sections of Tel Aviv where there used to be signs in Russian for all the Olim from Russia that now have signs in French for all the Olim from France. And you could walk into cafes in Tel Aviv, particularly in North Tel Aviv, and hear French spoken all the time. But why did Netanyahu's speech grate on me and on many other people? Because the Jews of the diaspora, by and large, with the exception of the Jews of Russia or of the former Soviet Union, believe that the idea of a modern, diverse nation state is possible. But Bibi Netanyahu went to Paris after the bombing of the kosher market and said, "Come home." He didn't say anything about you can fix France and you could fix this problem. He went and he said, "Come home." And from his point of view, he was right. But home, our nation of Israel today, is not necessarily comfortable home. The reaction of the Arabs to Jewish settlement was violent. That's part of why the Haganah was founded. And in 1929, the Jews in Hebron were massacred. From 1936 to 1939, there were Arab riots throughout Palestine against Jewish communities. So today, when you drive from Tel Aviv to Haifa, you'll pass a few kibbutzim on the way, and these kibbutzim are now very wealthy, incredibly successful kibbutzim. And you ask them, why are you here? What was the point? And they'll tell you, we were here because you couldn't drive from Tel Aviv to Haifa without being attacked by Arabs. So we put kibbutzim on the road between Tel Aviv and Haifa to protect the road and allow Jews to go between Tel Aviv and Haifa. When the riots started in 1936, the British realized our goose is cooked. The British realized our goose is cooked. We cannot run Palestine. The mandate won't work. They gave in to the Arabs in many ways by restricting Jewish immigration. Just before World War II, when Jews couldn't get into America, by the way, and couldn't get into anywhere else except maybe, believe it or not, the Dominican Republic and Cuba, the British closed the gates to Palestine. So now we start the period of World War II. And here we have an argument and a discussion that we're going to cover in greater detail next week between an older Ben Gurion and a younger Yitzhak Rabin. You might remember, and I've pointed it out a few times when I've led trips to Israel, that there are streets named after British officers. You know how we're having a big argument in America now about forts, military installations named after Civil War, Southern Confederate people? We have streets in Israel named after British officers. We have entire schools named after people like Ord Wingate. Why? Two reasons. One, Ben Gurion formed a Jewish brigade, and Jews went and fought as British soldiers in World War II. Rabin didn't want that to happen. Rabin thought, you're thinning out my Haganah to go fight in Europe. But at the end of the war, many British officers, despite Britain tilting strongly towards the Arabs, many British officers aligned themselves with the Zionist cause and helped the Haganah and Lehi and the Irgun to fight the War of Independence. World War II was in my mind, was definitely the most cataclysmic event that the Jewish people have suffered. It far surpasses the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, the disappearance of the 10 tribes. The Jewish people in Europe were almost wiped out. Many people will say they were wiped out. And the remnant is a remnant that won't survive. But the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, was at a loss about how to respond to that crisis. So the Jewish Brigade was one answer, and the Jewish Brigade gave us many of the officers of the Haganah after World War II was finished. And the other answer was dramatic and romantic, but horribly ineffective. And that was the story of Chana Senesh and Chaviva Reich, two Jewish women who parachuted into Europe to help Jews in ghettos and communities and Jewish partisans to carry on their fight. And both of those women lost their lives parachuting into Europe. So we come to this moment where the war is over. The British still are preventing Jews, and the Hama and the Irgun and the Lehi are struggling to create a state of Israel. May 14th, 1948 is the official date of the end of the British Mandate. Ben-Gurion and many others want to declare independence that day. It was Friday. All of you who've been to Israel with me have been to the Independence Hall, Echal Hatzmuot. And most of you heard, I think I've told it to all of you, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Why did Ben-Gurion declare the state of Israel in Tel Aviv? And the answer is he couldn't do it in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was under siege. You couldn't get to Jerusalem. But there's a second answer, which is that Tel Aviv is really the realization of the Zionist dream. Tel Aviv is an all-Jewish, all-Hebrew modern city that was literally built on the sand dunes north of Jaffa. And for the same reason that Moses Montefiore built a windmill outside of the walled city of Jerusalem and set up Yamin Moshe, the city where the Jews lived south of Tel Aviv was and is called Jaffa, and it too was a walled city. And the Jews had no room to continue to live in Jaffa. And they did agriculture, the famous Jaffa orange from the Jaffa orange groves that are now all gigantic apartment buildings. But the Jaffa Jews said, we got to get out of here. And they marched north less than a kilometer and built a city. And that's the city where Ben-Gurion, on May 14th, 1948, declared the state of Israel. And the world supported it. The world supported it. Everybody will tell you, don't say they supported it because of the Holocaust. Particularly Israelis, who were chalutzim, who were pioneers settling Palestine before World War II, will say it's not because of the Holocaust. But I think any objective view of the situation will tell you that one of the reasons the world supported the creation of the State of Israel was the murder of 6 million Jews. It's what motivated Harry Truman. And it's a little bit of what motivated Russia, the USSR, to recognize Israel. That's going to be it for today. We're going to go through the War of Independence, the Sinai Campaign, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, and Zionism today in the last lecture. We have a few minutes left. If anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment, just unmute yourself if you know how to do it. If you don't know how to do it, I'll unmute you. Any questions or observations?
Gary, quick question. You said the third lecture is next week because it says August.
It's in 2 weeks. Yeah, it's in 2 weeks.
Okay.
I think next week is
B'Av.
Fischer B'Av or something. Yeah, it's in 2 weeks.
Jerry, don't limit yourself. If it takes 2 more sessions, hallelujah.
All right, I'll see. I'll see about it.
Jerry,
Thank
thank you. Jerry, thank you very much. It's always very informative. I have a question. During the First World War, I know the English were around in that area. Did anything happen related to the First World War?
No. Related to the Second World War, though, I want to tell you a story. Robert Morgenthau Jr., when I queried him about, I had interviewed him for my movie, Harvesting Stones, but I asked him a whole lot of questions about World War II. And I said, the Americans really didn't do anything to save the Jews of Europe. They didn't bomb the railways to the concentration camps. They didn't seem to do anything. And he sort of yelled at me and he said, we attacked North Africa. We defeated Rommel. And in fact, the defeat of Rommel was very important to Palestine and to the Zionist movement. I mean, you have to remember that if Germany had won, the Zionist dream was over. Because if Germany won, it meant that Rommel took North Africa, and that gave him Palestine. So Morgenthau said, America helped the Jews by invading North Africa. His justification or explanation for not attacking the railways to the concentration camps. Any other questions?
I have a comment about Netanyahu's remarks after you had the bombing of the synagogues in France. He demanded that the bodies of the victims be buried in Israel, which was basically outrageous. There was quite a controversy over that.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, there was quite a controversy over that. You know, I mean, for us today, when there was the march of the people the good people on both sides, and they marched through saying the Jews will not replace us, the Jews will not replace us. What should our reaction be? Should it be we're going to defeat these Nazi-like thugs, or should our reaction be I'm packing my bags and going to Israel? You know, what's the reaction?
We don't want to have a president that would approve of that. So there's a very easy answer that time will allow us to do.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I didn't mean it as a political question, though.
Well, I did.
Okay. I meant it more as philosophically, do we as Jews resign ourselves to everybody will always hate the Jews, like that Tom Lehrer song says, and everybody hates the Jews? Mm-hmm. Or do we say we can make a better society where Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists are all respected and treated equally? You know?
Jerry, in addition to not bombing the railroads, didn't Roosevelt, I'd heard, close our borders to European Jews?
Yes, the St. Louis is a famous example of that. But Morgenthau had a very interesting insight for me to that. He said the failure of the St. Louis was that American Jewish billionaires would not pay the bribe that Cuba was demanding to accept all the people on the boat. Cuba held up the American Jewish community and said, pay us X number of dollars, and we'll let the St. Louis tie up and the people will disembark and stay in Cuba. And the American Jews didn't pay it.
But why was it closed in America? The State Department was very anti-Semitic in the United States
Yeah.
under Roosevelt. Is that the sole reason that Roosevelt closed the doors?
Well, I guess there were many reasons. There were legal reasons. There were State Department reasons. I mean, to this day, there are people in the State Department that are very anti-Israel.
You know, they didn't close the borders just during World War II. After the war, it was almost impossible for DPs to come to the United States. You had to have...
And the DP is telling you that. She was born in a DP camp.
Right. So you had to have a relative here who would take it upon himself or herself to promise that they would take care of you financially. You would never require aid from the government. And even then, they had a very strict quota. So we had an aunt here who was willing, my father had an aunt here who was willing to do that, but it took until 1951 for us to get our visa.
All right, the war ended in 45, folks.
Right. It took until 1951 for us to get our visa. I wanted to say one other thing about DPs. The United Nations sent an inquiry commission to the DP camps to ask the DPs where they wanted to go, because they recognized that countries weren't accepting them, and they didn't know if they had a, was there something that they needed, was there something they could do about it? And it was the almost uniform insistence of the DPs that they wanted to go to Israel that helped push the United Nations to arrange, to put it to a vote that that the British mandate be ended with this binational division of the land. But the DP's intense desire to go to Israel was a significant factor in that. And I have to say that it was also a political move, because in fact, not every single DP wanted to go to Israel, but they knew that this was a chance to make a difference for the state of Israel. And they desperately wanted a state of Israel, even if they personally wanted to go somewhere else.
Now, the Jews that were captured in Aliyah Bet and were in detention camps, either in Atlit, but more in Cyprus, flooded Israel as soon as Israel declared itself an independent nation. And there's a rather tragic and sad story. When you see the movie The Exodus, you see a very romanticized version of the people in the DP camp learning how to fight using broomsticks. The reality is, when many of them landed in Israel, they were thrown right into the war. And when I talk about the War of Independence, the War of Independence was the costliest war that Israel ever waged. There were more fatalities in the War of Independence than in any other war. And many of those fatalities were poorly trained Holocaust survivors who were thrown into battles. And some of them were thrown into the battle to open up the path to Jerusalem at Latrun, where Ariel Sharon was the commanding officer, and he too was wounded. But many DPs who tried to get to Israel on Aliyah Bet and were detained in Cyprus, when they were brought to the to Israel, to the new state of Israel, were in that battle and lost their lives. And it was a tough time. I
Hey,
might have
Jerry.
to do, yes?
Thank you so much. It is 7:30. I don't want us to be too late
Okay.
for
All right.
menu.